Hey, welcome back to Two Super Guys Red Sox. I'm Dylan.
And I'm Vinny. And with all the news talking about ending the Fed and whether or not the Federal Reserve should cut interest rates, and now Donald Trump's in the White House, he's pressuring Jerome Powell to cut rates. We're going to talk a little bit about the history of the Federal Reserve, why it's independent, and what sort of things it actually does, and whether or not that truly matters. Get to it. All right, my man. Here, Donald J. Trump ready to stab Jerome Powell in the back after having been the one that appointed him, which is
Yeah.
quite ironic to me.
Yeah.
Yeah, I know, right? So, this is the sort of headlines you're seeing. It's all over the place. If you Google it, you'll find it this week, and there's half a dozen articles at least that come up, where kind of Donald Trump has now taken a little bit of aim at Jerome Powell and the Federal Reserve and asking them to lower interest rates. He hasn't directly spoken to Powell. If you actually see down here, he says he will speak to Jay Powell at the right time. I don't know when that will be, but he is indicating that he's going to start applying direct pressure to the Federal Reserve to lower interest rates, which is interesting. All right.
Wasn't Jay Powell asked about this in not in the December one after Trump won? He's like, "What would you do if Trump asked you to step down or something like that?" He's like, "I mean, he can't." So
Yeah. I mean, yeah, exactly. There's a lot to the intricacies of how the Federal Reserve maintains independence.
yeah,
But one of them is, that they're only expected to step down in cases of like gross malfeasance in office.
right.
That they're really not expected to advocate the position, and that they're supposed to be able to make independent decisions. There's a whole like swath of literature about this if you really want to go down like a rabbit hole about the different prongs that make the Federal Reserve or any central bank independent, and which ones we have and don't have, and those sort of things. It's interesting though. But don't forget, I just wanted to point out Donald Trump is the one who actually put him in the office. And then I wanted to highlight some of the things he said about him at the time he put him in the office. That for a term of 4 years, beginning in 2018, it's been renewed under the Biden administration, which is an interesting kind of tidbit about how these Fed governors span basically presidential tenure, if you will, so that we see a consistency of the Federal Reserve, and it's independent in that it doesn't change with each and every regime, much like the executive branch of the federal government does change with each regime. Right? That he had served for the Federal Reserve for quite a while. He was also the Undersecretary of Treasury under George H.W. Bush, and that he had significant military business experience. Sorry, that prestigious background here, Princeton, and then he also got his JD from Georgetown, and he was a law review editor at his time at Georgetown. The Fed Reserve is kind of like our latest and still current iteration of central banking in the United States. But as you can see, we went through a few iterations during our early years before we finally got to this form that we have now, which is kind of interesting. Did you realize there were like many failed central banks before this?
I actually did not know that.
Yeah.
That is
Yeah.
news to
So
me.
the current system's only been in place since 1913. It's actually the Panic of 1907, which caused them to put this in place. Um, you know, Whether or not it still serves as the original function, it's mutated certainly over time. They've gained more and more independence, and they've kind of become more and more at the center, I guess, of American economic activity, if you will. This is like Google generational AI, background of where the Federal Reserve came from. But there's a lot of talk about this backwoods Jekyll Island conference where you have the Rockefellers and J.P. Morgan involved, and that really is a puppet of the extreme wealthy business owning class and banking class that propped this thing up, and then it's still in existence to this day, which is what prompted people to go so far as like there's been a legitimate call over the years for ending the Fed. We'll talk a little bit about a book written about that towards
But
the end of this presentation.
hold on, I'm just gonna shut up and wait for you to.
Yep.
You're
No.
gonna ask a question. You're probably about to answer.
Okay. So, what exactly is the Federal Reserve trying to do when it comes to monetary policy here? Okay. So, you've heard Jerome Powell talk about this dual mandate. The dual mandate being maintain maximum employment, most number of jobs possible in the U.S. economy, while still having stable prices, and that's been interpreted to mean inflation around 2% per year.
Yeah.
Right. They also have this third prong here, which is kind of, I guess, more we could argue that Trump is saying, hey, it's not just a dual mandate. There's actually three components to this, and one of them is to moderate the long-term interest rates. What you consider moderate is a different question. Right?
Yeah, well, because that number is drastically different 20 years ago. So I
Yeah.
mean, this is an evolving. People are if houses went to 15% There just be zero sales. There's just no more. It's just so it's not super realistic.
You'd have to see a significantly decline in prices in order for it to come back into balance. This little tidbit here I thought was kind of interesting. So the Treasury Department is responsible for printing the money, right? And
Hmm.
they do it through the Bureau of Engraving and Printing. Now, when it comes to coins, those are sold to the Fed by the Treasury Department at face value, right? But they actually get notes at cost, or the 7.4 cents per note, which doesn't change based upon the denomination of the bill. $100 bill would cost as much to print as a dollar bill. So it's a can you imagine how much money you could make if you could buy a product for 7.4 cents and then sell it for $100?
Yeah, a lot. That's I mean, that's essentially diamonds, right? Now that's a whole different rant. Never mind.
Yeah. There may or may not be a blood involved here. Okay. Um, so, what degree of freedom does the bank have? Right. This is kind of where we talked about why it's important. The main components here. This is once again generational AI. I'm still experimenting with the Google stuff here, um, but in order to achieve their goals, it would be in their best interest to have their own thought process making or their own independence as far as making decisions. Right. It's
Hmm.
hard to do it at the point of a gun. Right.
Right.
Particularly this last point here, avoid short-term decisions. Right now, in the short term, would decreasing rates certainly be a boom to the American economy and the stock market, and would go absolutely insane. And your TLT trade would go through 140, and my Russell 2000 trade would just take off bonkers, like through 300 a share. It's like 240 right now or 230 something. But would that be in the best interest of long-term price stability in the United States? That's the question.
As of right now, no. I feel like it's very easy to answer, and I'm not Jerome Powell, and I make way more money if I said yes. I
Yeah,
feel like this is
yeah,
not rocket science.
I agree. When we talk about, I guess whatever politics and money, particularly this election cycle is kind of interesting, where we saw people on the political left in the U.S. proposing more stimulus in terms of direct cash benefits to like American citizens.
No,
Now that's very apparent that they haven't learned the lesson of the most recent,
it's a
kind of a
terrible
surge
idea.
in inflation, right? And you see a similar kind of issue here now that we have Donald Trump in office, where he's pushing for lower interest rates, which also tends to have the same kind of effect in terms of inflating a currency. And that's what I'd be worried about here.
Yeah, it's just be patient. It's just that's a different rant. I'm trying not to get
Yeah,
political. It's they're both sides are trying to do too much in a small amount of time that they're in office. It's
yeah.
just wait 6 months and then see how you do. Just it doesn't have to be done right now.
As the Gen Zers will say, you're doing too much, brah.
Oh boy, oh good. Thank God we
All
hit
right.
that.
So I can't obviously talk about this topic and not discuss the book by Ron Paul here and the Fed. All right. And there's some interesting points that he makes from this. This is the Wikipedia summary if you're so inclined. I want to say I own it, but I don't think I've ever actually read it. But he argues that the Federal Reserve was created to bail out dead banks. Okay. I bet that's true, right? Like that, I don't think he can really deny that. He said it's bad for competition in making. I thought that was an interesting point in that you're not allowing banks to go out of business, but you are also who's going to be the one more likely to need the Federal Reserve's help? Smaller banks, right? The big banks are less likely to get into that position because they have like a broader diversity of their clientele as opposed to like a small regional bank, which would be much more susceptible to like a local shock.
Right.
That's
Okay.
one of his points. The argues that the Fed is both corrupt and unconstitutional, and that ultimately them causing inflation is going to lose the reserve status for the U.S. dollar and have a severe devaluation of the U.S. dollar. Like, is that a possibility? Sure. People always argue that the U.S. dollar is no longer backed by anything. I always would argue that it's backed by the power and faith of the U.S. military. At the end of the day, like we're not as advanced as we think we are. We're still at the pointy swords rule the world, right?
Uh,
Um,
this your second red arrow. I'm
uh-huh.
sorry. Below the first red arrow, it says he states the Federal Reserve is inflating currency today at nearly Zimbabwe levels. So that's just factually inaccurate. That's a stupid thing to say. He's not trying to make like an analogy. He's saying that it's at Zimbabwe level. Just to be clear here, Uh, 2020, 458, or sorry, inflation rate was 98%.
Yeah.
2021 was 104%. 2020 was 560%. Dude, we hit like eight.
So I don't
What
know what
the?
year this book was published. I imagine it's been a
I
little while,
I mean,
but
at no point were we. That's insane to me. That
yeah,
doesn't. That's
and especially you mentioned Weimar Republic. This is that famous image of a gentleman with a wheelbarrow full of banknotes. Like this is not even in the same realm as what we're experiencing now. So yeah, I agree. It's
okay.
very
That's fair. Maybe if it was published, publishing data is important because there's no way this has to be a
yeah.
relatively old book.
Maybe it was 1970s and the U.S. was experiencing 14% CPI inflation, and Zimbabwe
Okay.
was like 13% that year. I have no idea,
Oh,
but
jeez. Yeah.
we'd have to go back and look. But we could certainly do that. He argues that CPI is a regressive tax. Inflation is a regressive tax, and CPI doesn't reflect it well because we look at core CPI, we're excluding food and gas, which are much larger portions of the expenditures for lower class or lower income households, which is, I think, certainly a verifiable thing. And it is indeed a phantom tax or regressive tax that affects those that can least afford it the most. So yeah, I'll give him that point there. This is where you get into conspiracy theory a little bit here, talking about the J.P. Morgan and Rockefellers and like their little meeting in the island of Georgia. They're talking about creating the Federal Reserve. So okay, I mean, I don't know. I'm not a conspiracy theorist guy, but this last point that he makes here is 110% what we've experienced in our lifetimes, at least, of privatized profits and socialized losses. What do you think of
Okay.
that?
Yep. That's
Yeah.
fair.
Yeah, I mean, I completely agree. And the one last like kind of closing point here, and this is an interesting one. I always love. Um, Let me issue and control a nation's money, and I care not who writes the laws. So the argument there is that the person in control of the purse, in this case, Jerome Powell, has a significant impact upon the trajectory of the U.S. economy. And if you were Mayor Rothschild here of the Rothschild banking family dynasty, you'd argue that you'd probably rather be in Jerome Powell's position than Donald Trump's position when it comes to, their ability to influence the economics of American politics at this
That's
stage.
dark.
Yeah,
All
it
right.
is. Very.
But so the flip side, if if there wasn't a Federal Reserve and it was under presidential control, I would assume is what they're saying. If you had, I'm not going to name any administrations. If you had an administration who was spending an inordinate amount of money and also controlled the Federal Reserve, that's a big problem.
hmm
So, pretty good counter argument to not do that.
Yeah, I agree. I think the independence of a central bank is extremely important. And that although Donald Trump will seek out to pressure Jerome Powell, he's very fortunately in a position where he can ignore that pressure from a kind of moral, ethical responsibility. That's his job, is to ignore that and do what he thinks is best for the U.S. economy.
Yeah, I mean, imagine our government deficit. Would it go from like 20 trillion to like 34 trillion in like 6 years? Imagine
Mhm.
if there was no Federal Reserve on top of that. I feel like we'd be in 50s. I mean,
Yeah.
that's that's horrible. All right, well,
Yeah.
no boy.
All right. Well, let us know. I bet you there'll be a lively debate about the Federal Reserve down in the comments in this video. Check you
All
later.
right, we're gonna get ripped to shreds. All right, bye.